The Knights of Ren podcast is brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., your source for Star Wars Destiny singles, sealed product, and more. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this week's episode of the Knights of Ren. We have Rick and Jay as our hosts. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you all doing?
Hey, doing fine.
Awesome. So this week, we are going to be covering a very interesting deck that Jay encountered at his tournament out in Eudaimonia. So why don't you give us the breakdown of the event, and then let's get started into this quote-unquote fly fishing deck with some really interesting mechanics and some very interesting deck-building considerations.
I once again ran another event at Eudaimonia Games here in Berkeley. We had 14 competitors, including some new faces, which was pretty cool. And overall, everyone had a pretty good time. I personally ran a Jabba Dooku list that I sort of aped from Tiny, which ran some kind of fun stuff. It runs a small smattering of force powers, and it runs goofy things like Kylo Ren's lightsaber, that's not totally unheard of, but I know that card kind of flip-flops in and out of Vader Raider decks, but it was fun to mess with it on Dooku again, using all the focus sides. And then Tiny didn't run this, but I also added in the flamethrowers. He prefers the regular lightsabers for the redeploy. But I was having a blast using Force Choke to cross over onto my own team and switch to that force side and wallop pretty hard. And overall, I managed to go 3-1, but I lost in the last round to my friend Michael, who brought the aforementioned deck he calls Flyfishing, which is this really neat eAckbar hired gun Rebel Trooper deck, and we really wanted to sort of break this deck down and talk about it because, there's a lot of talk saying the meta is pretty heavily dominated by villains. Not saying heroes can't win. There's Qui-Gon Rey lists that have climbed to the top. There's some Han Rey tournaments. It does happen, but people still have the impression that it's a pretty oppressive villain field, especially with how much aggro comes into play. So I found this hero deck pretty awesome. Michael himself, he only collects hero cards, and this is the deck that he's sort of landed on. He's been playing well and been playing pretty consistently, and I was really happy for him, even though he knocked me out of the final, that he managed to pull this out. And yeah, so let's get into it.
So one of the first things I noticed in this deck is he's got a write-up on Star Wars Destiny DB, so we're going to post that in the show notes. But the first thing I like to look at when seeing how decks are built is the card cost, and he's got a really fun spread. He's got 8 cards at 0, 13 cards at 1, but then it goes into, he has no 2-drops. He has 6 3-drops. He has 1 4-drop and 2 5-drops. So the spread is really low or slightly higher than average. And I think that's important because looking at this off the top, you would be kind of confused as to why this would do well. But then if you actually look at the characters, we'll get started with that. You're running 2 eAckbars. 2 eAckbar die. You're running a Rebel Trooper die and a hired gun die. So eAckbar and hired gun can produce lots of money. eAckbar also has the 2 focus sides, so he can get you what you need when you need it. And I think that's incredibly interesting, just as the start of the deck has the capacity to handle low-cost cards and events, as well as high-cost cards and events.
Yeah, the big thing here with the 0-2 cost is that he's also not running Holdout Blaster in this list. This kind of goes into the fact that you're looking for red dice on your ranged for things like It's a Trap and that sort of thing, right?
This deck also lacks Jetpack for largely the same reasons. Always a strong card, but, as he even mentions to me himself, not having that range side to start things off, it's only got the modified sides, can really trip you up. So he preferred more red options and cut that guy out. And in regards to Holdout Blaster, he likes the card, but he feels that that sort of aggro ambush style action is more useful in aggro situations, and he didn't feel like it fit what he was trying to do. And again, it's gray. Yeah, we'll get into like substitutions later, but let's talk about what he does have. So in his version of the deck that he brought to the tournament, he has 11 upgrades, 2 DH-17 blasters, 1 DL-44 heavy blaster, 2 hunter downs, 2 IQAs, 2 promotions, 1 scout, and 1 second chance. So he's got all the red guns that he can run. You can't run F11s without Finn. He's got the promotions. He's got a scout. He really liked the effect of scout. He's actually going to make a substitution later to get a second one in there. The hunter downs are great for just like free shields. He's also a really big fan of being able to delay actions. So he really likes hunter down, being able to play it as a pseudo pass, and then like being able to activate it as another pseudo pass. So he's a very patient player, and a lot of these little like he likes to call them dirtily actions. Really like lends into his play style, which I think is really neat and shows with these.
So when you played him, I'm noticing he's got 2 DH-17s, 1 DL-44, and 2 blaster rifles. So he only has 5 cards that can add 5 dice to his field, essentially. How many of now we'll get to the supports here in a second, but how many of those did you actually see him play when you played a game? Like, did he only hit 2 of those 5 potentially?
In our game, specifically in the final round, he got both promotions and a DH-17 on eAckbar. He also got a hunter down into play, and then eventually he could have played the DL-44. He had that in his hand. I had a very tough round against him where I could not roll very much damage. So jumping ahead to his support list, he runs 1 black 1. He brought 1 launch bay to that event. That was a late addition. And then he also has 1 Falcon. Sometimes he rolls money heavily on the first round, and so he's actually gotten a lot of mileage out of his black 1. He got the black 1 out in our game, and he went special into 2 damage on turn 1, which isn't likely, but it happened, and it definitely impacted my game a lot. It's a reliable die, and it synergizes with one of the obvious additions in his event list. He definitely runs It's a Trap. He also runs 1 all-in, 2 electroshocks, 1 field medic, 2 flanks, 2 hit and runs, again 2 hit It's a Traps, 2 logistics, 2 rearms, and 2 reversals. So overall, he's got a meager amount of damage. He has some disruption with scout, some more support dice with promotion. He runs 1 second chance. One of the clever things I like about this deck is hired gun is probably the last guy to live in a lot of situations. The rebel trooper will probably kill itself guarding things off, or becoming, an easy target for your opponent to finish off on its own. eAckbar gets pretty scary because he likes to put a lot of upgrades on eAckbar, so you definitely want to try and get rid of him and all that focusing, and maybe even get rid of him because you don't want to mess with his ability, which came into play in our game because he actually It's a Trapped for discard and knocked out my hand. And then, of course, I also took 2 damage for it, so that was a play I wasn't expecting, but made a lot of sense and was a cool way to use It's a Trap, even though eAckbar is the only die that has red discard at this time. It might get nastier in the future, though.
Interesting. Okay, so the deck is built as obviously mid-range. So when you're playing against it, and you were saying he likes to play patiently, what is the play style? Because a lot of times, people we've talked to, they're used to aggro, they're used to control. Are you like rolling out some dice and then resolving 1 here and there, and then using, your dirtily actions to kind of see what your opponent plays out? Can you elaborate on how this works as a mid-range deck?
Again, like I mentioned, like the hunter downs help you play slow, supports help you play slow. He likes to roll some dice out and then use his like blaster pistols and IQAs as rerolls, and then snapping them back with rearm, which he and I agree is one of the more fun things that heroes get to do. I really wish rearm was neutral, but it's not, so that's something cool that heroes get to do. Paying 2 for IQA is really, really good. And free DH17s is nothing to, sneeze at either. He likes to build up money, and then obviously he'll sit on reversals for a while and see if you reroll into something good and throw it in your face. He has hit and runs when he wants to, do something scary, and he hit and ran with eAckbar and somehow managed to roll he tells me I'm misremembering. He definitely rolled a damage side on eAckbar, and then with the guns that he had in play, he got a bunch of modified sides and managed to shoot Dooku 2 separate large times for like 3 and 4 with his natural side, a +2 from a DH17, a natural side from another DH17, and then a +3 from IQA all in one roll. And yeah, Dooku evaporated. What's neat is like this deck does have like little tricks. Like it's got the hit and run, it's got the It's a Traps, it's got reversals. If you manage to get Millennium Falcon out, you can do, unlimited reversals and electroshocks. This is often referred to as like a bag of tricks deck, or like, a master of none. Early on, I was trying to convince him to make this into the heavy money making support decks, or as some would regard like Hyperloop style or anything like that. And he just kind of likes the versatility and like not being so, all in on that type of deck style. He prefers more spread out and having options, so he can adapt based on the types of opponents he plays. And again, that's why we're talking about this deck. I think this deck has a whole lot of tools, and it can hit hard. Like you can focus the higher gun using promotions and eAckbar, and you will have the money to pay for his shots and getting the most out of your weapons and your heavy supports. There's just a lot of ways to play this deck.
Now, the one thing we haven't talked about is the battlefield, and he brought Mos Eisley Spaceport, but as I understand, he recommends actually not utilizing it and picking your opponent's battlefield. Is there a specific reason why he just doesn't care about the battlefield that he's bringing to the table?
Yeah, he finds Mos Eisley as the neutralist battlefield, the one least likely to hurt you. And he says like you can sort of use it with Hunker down, but that's not necessarily why he uses it. Basically, he picked it for the least amount of opportunity for it to burn him. And yeah, if he wins the die roll, he almost always exclusively picks his opponent's battlefield, so he can put the shields on Rebel Trooper and give him effectively 9 health and make it safe to eat some Guardian damage. Because again, he's not very aggro minded, he's not very aggressive in the early rounds. He tries to like build up and play some cards out and see what you're doing, and he plays slow and methodical. And yeah, he mostly feels like he picked that one so his opponent is less likely to pick his and more likely to pick their own, which again would give him the shields.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot in playing, that Mos Eisley Spaceport, if you are playing on that battlefield, your opponent very rarely ever utilizes it. And this deck doesn't look like something that is going to be claiming the battlefield too often anyway, except on like big all-in turns and stuff like that, or big hits of trap turns. And then being able to get just a little bit of bonus out of the hunker downs, after you've used them, is also just a bonus there.
Yeah, he did try to snake away battlefield priority from me a few times. One thing that kind of happens with this deck is you'll end up with some dice that like will be on sides you're not too worried about. So he actually does kind of get a little competitive on the battlefield claim. And again, like this is a deck that you can just sort of play at your opponent's pace, so to speak. But yeah, I just really like the removal he has with the flanks and the electroshocks and reversal. And yeah, again, this deck is just like consistency and options.
And he's not running anything that requires him to take the battlefield like dug in or anything like that. So it's something that I'm actually surprised is not in here. But because of the Rebel Trooper, he mentions in his write-up that you want those shields at the start of the game. But almost every eAckbar list I've ever seen is running 2 field medic and two dug-ins. He's only chosen to run 1 field medic in here.
And it's nice because this is the kind of deck that I think a lot of players are looking for in regards to like that mid-range toolbox, because it has a lot of answers to a lot of specific situations, which at the current moment, most of the decks we've seen have great answers to only a few certain situations. This, like you said, it's kind of a jack of all trades. Like, it's not really specifically amazing at one thing, but it can answer plenty of things. You know, you've got the removal, you've got health, you've got guardian, you've got enough characters to put your equipment on. Your supports are full of really strong effects. And not only that, but Black One and Millennium Falcon have no pay to resolve sides. So once you've got that card out on the field, you've already paid the cost in full. Everything you roll from that point on is going to resolve. And so you can allocate your resources to your event suite, your upgrades, paying for hired gunshots, things like that. And I think that's incredibly smart that even though some of the cards are expensive, once they're on the field, that's it. You don't have to worry about sustaining them any longer.
Yeah, and something else to mention too, and he brings it up himself, but all three supports, all three legendaries, they don't make the deck. The deck doesn't fall apart without them. If you wanted to cut the Black One, if you wanted to cut the launch bay, or if you wanted to cut the Falcon, you can add scouts, you can add jetpacks, you can add holdout blasters, you can get the other all in there. Like, there's definitely some like substitution wiggle room. You can go for some of the more aggressive options, or get those dug-ins or a couple more defensive things. So again, that's kind of the nice thing that this deck is just a toolbox. And I personally think Black One and Falcon are awesome. I could go either way on Launch Bay. That card feels, really good when it's good, but can be hard to resolve or get what you want out of it with like the type of removal that's in this game. But, Falcon is like a huge threat, and I'll say it again, I've never been on the train that thinks that Black One is garbage. I think it's niche, but I think this is actually a deck that can get mileage out of Black One.
Okay, so let's ask the standard question. When you're going for that opening hand and your mulligans, he wrote this up. What exactly are we supposed to be looking for? And what are we trying to get rid of? If you pull up, hey, here's such and such, you don't want to keep that.
So he lists in here you want to keep your hunkered downs, of course, except against the melee only teams. Again, the shields being pretty important for Rebel Trooper and keeping eAckbar alive. He really likes the one drop upgrades, the DH-17s, promotions, and the scouts. Via rearm against Vader Raider is what he's showing on here, I guess, to be able to mitigate a little bit of the loss or actually turning that discard into a benefit for him, which is another good idea that I really didn't even think of. And then logistics to be able to ramp into your higher cost curve here.
Yeah, I find it really interesting. Rearm is one of the cards I've always looked at and tried to figure out how to use it efficiently. And I did have the idea about, using your guns as reroll fodder. But it's interesting that this deck actually turns a Vader effect into a benefit where you can early game say, when you're playing Destiny, it's all about resource management. You're trying to manage your cards, your dice, your damage. Everything is a resource that you're trying to micromanage to be as efficient as possible. And your opponent is paying a lot of points for Vader to eat a card out of your hand when you activate him. And this is a brilliant tactic where you take that advantage that your opponent is paying for and you actually use it to make your resources and your economy more efficient, because you get rid of a card you wanted to play and then you use rearm to play it for free. You do lose 2 cards out of the deal, but you keep your resources and now you have an extra die. The effect of Vader didn't really hurt you that much. In fact, it probably helped you, because now any resources you have, you can allocate to electroshocks, your removal, if you need to play It's a Trap or something else, you still have money for that, and you were able to equip a card that gives you a die for nothing. So that's a really strong usage of rearm and getting rid of cards out of your hand to get that reduction in paying the cost of the card.
Yeah, I definitely think that you just want to get rid of the super expensive cards, the one-ofs like the Falcon and the Launch Bay. Maybe also pitching IQAs if you have the couple of the one drops to be able to progress your board state a little bit without getting bogged down into paying or hoping you're rolling your resources on your hired gun and eAckbar. But other than that, yeah, I can see it definitely being you can go a lot of different ways on that.
Another thing I really enjoy in this deck is he has one DL44 Heavy Blaster and one Second Chance. Something I've noticed about players who try to go very heavy on the DL44 is that gun is like disgustingly unreliable. Sure, it can hit like really super hard, but 2 miss sides and being able to have it manipulated against you, frankly, it's just a hard gun to like really put all your ages into. But I do think one is nice. It's also like a combat trick. It removes a die. It has ambush. So I think it's neat that he has one in there because there are times where, you know, one can get the job done. And then again, like, Second Chance is a cool stall tactic because I again feel that the hired gun is probably going to last longest. Sometimes your opponents might try to knock hired gun out so that you can't play Electroshock, but that's really all you're losing if he does die, and you can't play the Second Chance. But I don't see the hired gun being the main target. You know, often your opponent sort of sees him as a detriment because you have to pay to get him to fight. So I kind of, again, I just like, if it gets to that point, the Second Chance is really clever in keeping him around long enough that you can probably close the game out with some of your upgrades and using your heavy stuff and all the cool events that you probably have left over. So
Right, and something to consider when you're building a deck or playing a deck like this. You know, when we're talking about your opening hand, your mulligans, you don't want cards like Second Chance, your Field Medics, your DL44 Blaster Pistol. You don't want them in your hand because those are cards you definitely want to see mid to late game. You don't need the Second Chance until someone's about to die. So sitting on a Second Chance you can't use and you're not going to use means you essentially have a 4-card hand. And unless you intend on pitching that for a reroll, which you probably don't want to do, it's better to get that back in the deck and get an option in your hand you either want to see or an option that you can use in case of an emergency. And same thing goes with, you know, your DL44. You know, hey, you have a Millennium Falcon in your hand or a black one, but no logistics. You do have to consider you can roll money to get those out turn 1, but is that really what you want to do? Because this deck wants to play slow. You want to have setup. You want to load up one of your characters with a bunch of equipment. So it does depend on the way you build the deck, but you have to consider these things. You know, when you're looking at that opening hand, you want cheap and efficient stuff early on with some removal. And then you want to see your black one, your Second Chance, you know, your blaster pistols, maybe turn 3 or 4, so that you can pop those out because you have the money and you have the board state to sustain that. So now that we've kind of gotten through that first opening hand, let's talk about the matchups. So I know in the write-up he's talked about playing against Grievous and Dooku, but Night Sister and Bala and things like that. What do you think about this deck versus, you know, let's talk about the standard aggro. You know, we've seen Django Veers, we've seen Bala and Friends. You could argue you've got some Django Trooper stuff. What do you think this deck does against very hard aggro, and how can it sustain itself against that, considering you do have some squishy characters?
Yeah, luckily, most of the aggro decks right now are ranged base, while we're seeing a whole lot of hunker downs lately. So getting those early hunker downs, definitely going second, taking the shields, probably putting them on the Rebel Trooper in order to get rid of, to snipe out some of their non-modified sides, try and mitigate as much damage as possible early on. Again, eAckbar is probably going to be their first target to get rid of his focus, and also allowing them to pitch to reroll to dig as much damage as they can. The lack of dug-ins here kind of hurts that matchup a little bit, but again, you make up for it with the hunkered downs. And you know, if you had one more field medic, if it's a heavy aggro meta that you're playing in, I don't think that would hurt too much either. But it's going to be a slow paced game for you. You're going to react to what they're doing, to what they're going after, and trying to get in your damage when you can. Again, with the heavy ranged aggro decks, it's a trap is really good in that matchup because they're going to be rolling out as much range as they can. Allows you to get out some more dice in that situation, and then it's a trap. Again, picking out the non-modified sides, slowing them down as much as possible with the Guardians and the Electroshocks and the flanks will get you further into the game. And the longer this game goes, the more heavily I think this deck is favored.
All right, so the next matchup, obviously, we've talked about this deck tons of times. It's my favorite type of deck to play, and that's the control matchup. So there's actually some specific matchups I want to cover in the write-up. He talks about Grievous and Dooku. He would want to know. His statements are, you should focus Grievous, keep upgrades on eAckbar only, force damage onto your other characters, aggressively remove dice. If you survive long enough, you can power through whatever Dooku tries to do. He also talks about the Jabba Dooku, control mid-range. He says, I don't know, get lucky. My opponent didn't roll damage and I focused Dooku down quickly. I want to talk about our takes on this just based on the build. When you're facing that control deck, we've seen Vader control, Dooku Vader. There's obviously your Dooku and friends, so Dooku with Jabba, Dooku with Kylo. You're going to see control decks. They're popular. They're a lot of fun. This deck is not a control deck. It's a mid-range deck. So what do you guys think are the strengths and vulnerabilities in dealing with, decks of that control style?
So generally, mid-range decks kind of struggle against control decks. The good thing here is that the control decks of late are running a lot of the villain blue dice manipulation, which has a tendency to turn dice to blanks or things like that, which again, it's a trap. It lets you kind of be able to mitigate some of that control aspects of it. Now, granted, you're not going to be able to then change into the range damage sides more often than not, just because they're not there. The blue villain obviously is mostly melee. Yellow with Jabba is not going to give you anything you're going to really want to turn to, except for possibly discard sides, and then being able to discard in where to trigger your eAckbar ability. All in, and the focus that you get out of eAckbar helps a lot there too. You then become the aggressive deck in this matchup. You want to deal as much damage quickly as possible, and having access to things like Black One and Launch Bay and Millennium Falcon that can have big chunks of damage to help eat through Dooku, like Jay mentioned earlier in his game.
The other nice thing about that is all three of those, Black One, Launch Bay, and Millennium Falcon, have numbers that are bigger than Electroshock can deal with. And so your opponent is going to have to spend their strongest removal, if they're running flanks, if they're running he doesn't like you, things like that, they're going to have to eat those to get rid of, say a Black One rolls a 3, Millennium Falcon rolls 4 damage, you've got enough cards in your hand that anything from Launch Bay is 3 or higher. They're going to have to allocate a lot of heavy removal, and that means later in the game they're not going to be able to stop you, or sometimes they just choose to eat the damage, and that can give you the advantage that you need to start pushing through. Because, removal only goes so far. You can't remove everything. And if you have, eAckbar has the 2 focus. You've got your Rebel Trooper eating away small bits of damage. Because most control decks aren't dealing bursts of damage. And they're also not running a lot of modified sides. You're just going to see like a flat 3 damage from a Vader, or if you're running, say, a lightsaber of sorts, you're just going to see a modified 2 or a flat 3 for 1, and you can remove that, you can guard in and away, you can get rid of it, and that's most of the damage that your opponent has, and that's great, because now, sure, they can remove your cards, they can remove your resources, but you can still reliably produce resources to get cards onto the field and roll that damage and start to single out an opponent's character and focus it down until it's too late.
Yeah, and that going back to what you were saying about how it's, they'd have to use their flanks and such to get rid of the Black One, Launch Bay, and Millennium Falcon dice. That's another little hidden difficulty for them here, is that you're running a 3-character list with these large support dice here, where you can roll out your Falcon, hit a 4 damage side that they can't flank away because you have 3 characters too, right? So it's probably very beneficial. And looking through there's not a lot of modified sides on this deck's dice either. Is if you roll that 4 damage, go ahead and throw that 4 damage at them. You don't have to save it. There's modified sides on 7 of your dice here. So this isn't a deck that you're going to need to do a whole lot of saving up of non-modified sides to be able to get off your big burst damage. Your burst damage is actually coming from your supports.
Right. And I play purely control. So and I play villain control. So the only thing, I mean, let's just go over a couple of the hard removals. So isolation, you have to get rid of a character die. So if you have like Millennium Falcon, this is just something to consider. You know, if you've got one of these supports out and it's your turn, you can't isolate away a support die. If you're going first, you can roll out whatever support die and you're fairly safe. It's not perfect, but your opponent can't use it. He doesn't like you because they have to have a die on the field to remove one of your die. If you roll high enough, you can't electroshock it. If all of your characters are readied, they cannot flank it. Your opponent can't really use the force because your Millennium Falcon doesn't have a blank. Sure, they could flip Launch Bay or Black One to the blank, but you still got eAckbar with double focus, so that's not an optimal play. It is possible. Things you should be aware of would be something, say, like reversal, deflect. If someone is running shoot first, they can pop your Millennium Falcon or Black One or your Launch Bay back at you. So there are a couple cards to be aware of, but I mean, not many people run shoot first, and if someone's running blue villain, you can expect the deflect, so you can force them to use it early, and then, next turn, roll the Millennium Falcon. They're probably not going to deflect it away a second time, and if they do, that's it. They're out of deflects. Something to consider is, if you are playing against a blue villain, try and pop that blue villain as soon as you can. If they're running both blue villains, then there's nothing you can really do to shut off, say, deflect or some of the other removal cards. But, I mean, these are just really strong anti-control cards because it's hard to deal with Millennium Falcon and control. It really is, especially if you're going first. Black One isn't impossible, but then again, do I really want to stop Black One when Admiral eAckbar can roll out and he could potentially hit 2 focus and turn his upgrades into massive amounts of damage that he's still not going to have to pay for? So it keeps your control player in check because they can't just willy-nilly remove whatever they want. They really have to consider the plays, and they really have to consider spending their resources efficiently, because if they just remove all your dice, they're definitely not going to be able to play much of the cards out of their hand. Even if they have a holocron, they can still holocron something onto the field, but they can't roll it, and that gives you the advantage because you can still play your cards, you can still roll your dice, and you're not going to have to pay for much outside of like the hired gun and certain upgrades. So now the final match, at least the more traditional match, is if you play a toolbox like this against a mid-range deck. Both decks are trying to set up. Both decks are trying to slow play. Both decks have some removal, and they have pretty efficient die faces where whatever they roll, they're generally not going to have to pay to resolve. So what do you guys think this can do or should do in case you saw the mirror match, or you saw something like, Dooku and Phasma, strong mid-range decks with ample damage and efficient tools?
So one of the tricks I often see Michael doing with this deck is sort of trying to counter kill when you've worn down one of your opponent's guys to reasonably low and then they roll out. That's when you drop it's a trap. That's when you drop the hit and run or the reversal and sort of exactly as I said it, counter kill them so then they lose all those dice, or they sort of lose half their turn. So yeah, that's one of the interesting ways he plays, where he kind of tries to set you to wounded and then just snap you out of the game. So
kind of spreading the damage across, keeping everybody at a fairly within range of striking distance.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't often split it, because again, usually the best thing to do in this game is to focus fire, but there are times where I was confident and I was all right, well, at least roll out Dooku, and that's when he basically just went ham and blew me out, and my 3 upgraded Dooku evaporated, and Jabba was not in a position. He had a little damage on himself. He had managed to, with a couple of random discards off of eAckbar, he got rid of my backup muscles before I could play them. Yeah, there's just a lot of little ways that this deck can put pressure on you while playing slow, but when push comes to shove, it does have damage. Rebel Trooper, he can hit pretty hard, especially with It's a Trap. All the focus that you get out of eAckbar, all your guns, they do gun things. Exactly what you want them for. Again, this deck runs mostly cheap, so it's actually pretty reliable to be able to play reversal or these heavy supports. So it's a very reactionary deck. I mean, in a mid-range game, it's mid-range versus mid-range, it's usually just who gets those little edges, who has initiative, who gets the first kill is generally like what you're looking for and what you're watching out for. If you can get rid of their tricks using discard, if you can shield up, or whatever tiny little advantages you can get is usually like your method against mid-range.
One of the pieces of advice in his write-up is, as you play, and he's talking about the pace of the deck, he's trying to say, you should try to end rounds with at least one resource so you can get potential reversals off. He also says, once eAckbar is fairly damaged, make sure you have 3 upgrades on him, and then start playing faster using hit and run, it's a trap, all in, things like that to pounce on your juicy enemy targets. And I think that's extremely interesting that we should probably mention is when you see a deck such as like Poray, you'll see hit and run as soon as humanly possible. Like those people who play those decks traditionally, if they have hit and run or all in, they'll try and roll out and then use all in real fast. Or they'll try and use hit and run, throw out a Poe, and then resolve his special as soon as you can. And the way this deck uses those cards is a little bit opposite, where you're trying to load up on eAckbar, wait until someone is within a squishy range, and then you pop hit and run, roll eAckbar, get as much damage as humanly possible, and then resolve to get the kill. Or, for example, you could roll hired gun first, and then you have something out on the field, use hit and run on eAckbar, you roll him out, and then you've got potentially enough damage to kill or severely maim someone, and your opponent can't respond with removal. So that's another thing that this deck does, is it uses the same cards other people use, but in a completely different fashion. And I think that's amazing that if you wanted to, sure, you could use hit and run early game. You could get, a couple things on eAckbar or your Rebel Trooper, roll it out real fast, get some quick bursty damage. But the intention is to use it mid to late game so you get kills. This is similar to the sideways damage Jay talks about with Balatique and things like Arm to the Teeth or Fight Dirty, is you get someone within, squishy range damage. You get them in range of killing, and then you go for the kill by using card effects faster than your opponent can stop you. And I think that's really interesting, is that this deck has that option. If someone is, say you've got Jabba or Dooku or Vader, 3 damage left, you could probably hit that if you have eAckbar loaded up on equipment. It's not always going to happen, but it is very likely. And if you don't, you can still reroll. You could pitch some cards, get the rerolls, and now your opponent has to remove those dice to keep their characters alive. Like, you have them in a very difficult situation, and that's exactly what this deck wants, is you want control of the game state. You want to mitigate their damage, and you want to force them to remove your dice so that they can't stop you. They can't ignore you. Another matchup he talked about specifically is Evir's Bala Night Sister, or the deck we talked about last week that Jay and D-House have been rolling with your Night Sister, your Trooper, and Phasma. So he recommends killing Night Sister off first so you can turn off the blue-only cards. That is one of the best pieces of advice we can ever give. If you see opponents running a deck with one blue character, get that blue character off the field as soon as humanly possible, because most blue cards require you to spot a blue character to do a thing. Night Sister is easy to kill because her HP is really, really squishy, and turning off a bunch of not only removal cards, but effectively turning these cards into rerolls means that your deck is going to survive in the long run, and your opponents are going to have dead draws, which is great for decks like these, because you can keep playing your cards and they have to spend their cards for rerolls, or they have to pitch them and draw more cards out of their deck in order to have a better hand to gain field advantage and game advantage. So, or for example, if you're playing a deck and you see one yellow character, one red character, red's probably not as dangerous, but if you see one yellow character, it's worth trying to focus fire that character down so you can get rid of electroshocks, things like that. I mean, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, your usual suspects there, like the one random hired gun or the one random Night Sister, like he talks about in his write-up, and being able to turn off those cards is usually pretty powerful. Kind of like in the Bala Django Trooper list, it getting rid of the one Trooper takes care of 6 cards in a lot of those decks. So yeah, again, just picking a target that may not seem like the biggest threat, but can shut down a lot of your opponent's deck is sometimes the best way to go.
So here's a really interesting question. Jay might have some insight on it. What do you do if you face the mirror match? I mean, this could be popular, this might not be popular, but it's such a well-built toolbox that if you saw this exact deck across the table, I'm really curious to hear how you guys think you should play against it, because both decks are going to be trying to do the same thing. You're going to try and load up on eAckbar. You're going to try and pull out the burst damage and kill someone real fast. If you don't get the cards you need for loading up eAckbar, you can make enough money to play big drops like Black One or Launch Bay or Falcon. If you're not running those, your deck is going to now have less supports, but you're going to have access to holdout blasters, scouts, jetpacks, and you're going to be able to either have massive higher burst damage, or you're going to be able to look at their hand and pull options out, which makes eAckbar scary, because if your opponent allocates cards to rerolls, you can potentially, disrupt or discard that last card in their hand and get free damage. So what do you guys think is a strong way to play this in the mirror?
One of the things you're probably hoping for is you want to be the one ideally going second and getting those shields so that you can, again, mitigate what little early damage. One of the things is, if eAckbar rolls his 1 damage side and you can Guardian that off, he loses his potentially juicy, reroll dice. Whenever you can Guardian 1 damage off of a die is really phenomenal. So there are things like that. Knowing that you can pop off eAckbar if you get that, all-in trick or that hit-and-run trick is obviously fairly good. And again, with all mirror matches, it's usually whose clockwork machine, starts, the gears start turning into place before the other guy. That type of thing. As far as specific strategies, eAckbar is the scariest dude. If they drop their heavy supports, try and dig for those reversals and throw those meaty heavy range damage shots back in their faces. And aside from that, just always be aware that whatever trick you're trying to do, they can do it too. So don't walk into your own "it's a trap."
Yeah, I think eAckbar is the obvious first target there. Because not only do you get rid of his 2 dice, you're getting rid of his potential resources and focus, things like that, which then leaves Hired Gun pretty hard to use effectively and then still be able to afford the expensive stuff in this deck. But again, these mirror matches are going to a lot of times come to rolls and who draws better and who gets what out when. Obviously, the early supports will determine the winner most often than not in this game, that matchup. The person to get out a Falcon and a Black One out first is probably going to be pretty highly favored on that. Unless, of course, the other person is drawing all their reversals and throwing 4 damage back at eAckbar a couple times.
Yeah, I definitely think decks like this, any deck you ever play, that mulligan is one of the most important decisions you can make during the game, because I see so many players look at a hand of cards, and you have to understand that if the card isn't inherently going to give you some kind of advantage very quickly, maybe turn 1 or 2, but if you draw Millennium Falcon and you don't have any way to get that out efficiently, you don't have logistics, you don't have any kind of enhancement to your resources, it is very possible with 3 dice that have 2 resources on them and the 2 resources you start with, it is possible to get it out. But it is more efficient to pitch that card and get yourself a blaster pistol or a promotion or a scout, because the more dice you roll through the game, the more options you have, the more damage you can deal, the more things you can do. And getting a guaranteed die out as opposed to potentially playing a Falcon is in my opinion, is astronomically better and will help you push towards victory, as opposed to you could potentially play this die, but you also might not get the rolls you need, and now you don't have the equipment you wanted to actually do something, and you're sitting on a dead card in your hand, and you now have to make the decision, do I spend any resources? So now maybe turn 2 I can play Millennium Falcon, but do I let my opponent roll the damage and deal it to me? Do I use my removal? It's just one of those things, if you can't reliably play a card early game, I highly recommend put it back in the deck, reshuffle, and try and mulligan into playable cards, because that's going to give you the advantage you really, really need. Obviously, if you put the Falcon back in, you draw it again, there's nothing you can do about it. But play, early game, play as best as you can to get cheap upgrades and some removal so that you have the options to actually play the game. If you're sitting on cards you can't play, your opponent has a major advantage, whether they know it or not, because the cards in your hand are not useful. And you really don't want to discard them for rerolls, but you also can't play them because you don't have the resources to do it. And so you're in a really bad situation because you're kind of stuck. And that early game, turn 1, turn 2 can make a big difference in the long game. If your opponent is able to roll out a few pieces of damage, you don't stop it and you don't play anything. All right, so we've talked about, the matchups, what the deck is, what the deck does. What do you guys feel is probably the weak points of the deck? Weak matchups, weak places that the deck might suffer in, so that we can help people, if they come across certain situations or bad matchups, it's not an uphill battle. They actually have some knowledge and advice on how to get out of bad situations.
Earlier in our testing, this deck does run into a little bit of trouble with the explosivity of the Ibala and friends lists, especially against things like Fight Dirty and Backup Muscles and things like that, being able to indirectly chew through eAckbar to get around things like Reversal and Guardian and being able to hit targets with indirect damage.
There's a little bit of a weak part in the dice manipulation in the deck, only having access to Electroshock and Flank. I think it may need a couple of disarms in here, which to help with, you have Falcons and Launch Bays and Black Ones that can get those high upgrade dice off the table. And you could feasibly hit anything. Yeah, I can't think of anything that you couldn't hit with this. You can even hit Mind Probe, or you can't hit Mind Probe because it's not an equipment, but you get what I'm saying. You can hit all the 3-cost equipments with this and then never have to deal with that specific one again. It'll help a little bit in there. But only having Flank and Electroshock as your only dice manipulation means that you're going to be taking damage, and not having the extra shields from Dug In and the 2 of Field Medics means that if that starts happening, then you need to turn on the gas really quick and start taking out characters left and right, or you're not going to make it. If you get in an early hole from damage, it's like Jay was saying, a quick Fight Dirty will kill a character, untap Bala, and then you got even more damage you got to deal with.
Do remember that this deck can fairly reliably play Reversal, so it does have 6 die removal options overall. Reversal only hits damage, it's what you want it for, but it still is a little weak. It runs what it can. Historically, Michael hasn't been a fan of Negotiate because you don't have enough control over what you get rid of, and it hurts you too. So while it is a weakness, there isn't a whole lot better. Disarm could be really good, but a lot of times too, you tend to be getting your head kicked in by like Force Throws and Mind Probes, which Disarm doesn't save you from, which is why I see a lot of people cut it. Kicking off Jetpacks and TH-17s and F-11s has its place, so it depends on what's in your meta and what you're fighting.
Yeah, I didn't really count Reversal for some reason, but yeah, you're right. Reversal in there for some dice manipulation, and if you can live the dream and get a Reversal off again with Millennium Falcon, you'll be just fine.
One of the things I really like about this is you can tell, Jay is obviously tested with his buddy, but it's well thought out. And I have to say, this is not going to be a deck that plays itself. You're going to have to master the deck by playing a lot of games. When you run decks like Django Veers with pure aggro, no one can just sit down and let a deck play itself in Destiny. And I really like that, unlike certain card games where, you just play very linearly, draw a card, play a card, tap the card, attack with a card. You really have to make educated decisions to pilot decks well. And this is obviously one of those. You've got lots of options for lots of situations. You can do a lot of damage. You can mitigate damage and then poke out people. You can spread damage across the field. You've got choices, and that's what makes decks good, is having choices and ways to deal with situations. But in order to make the proper choice, and experience is incredibly important So you have to play the deck, against Vader Raider, against Django Veers, against Poe Ray. You've got to play the deck against multiple matchups in order to know what you're supposed to do in a specific matchup. All the advice we give you, all the experience we give you, it's useful, but each individual player has to sit down with these decks and play them out, because just because we have advice doesn't mean your opponent is actually going to play the way we tell you. A lot of great players play differently depending on who they're playing, the matchup they're playing, what they know they're playing against, and playing linearly the same time every way is extremely dangerous because you become predictable. So the best advice we can give about playing any of the decks we build is definitely build a deck and go out and play it. Play it on Tabletop Simulator, play it at your local event, play it casually, play it with your friend, test it out, find out what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Another big thing is your meta is totally different from Jay's. My meta is totally different from Rick's. We each have different metas, and some of these cards may or may not be viable depending on the meta that you're facing. If you're in a heavy area with melee damage, Hunker Down isn't as efficient. If you're in a melee weak area where people are running tons of shooting range damage decks, hey, It's a Trap and Hunker Down are golden. Those things are fantastic against range decks. Just things to consider when you're building this deck. It's never just a golden goose where what we say is, king of the hill. You have to see what's going on in your area and make educated decisions. But this is probably my favorite hero deck I've seen for Toolbox right now, because you've got access to strong damage, strong control, you have excellent health, you have damage mitigation on the Rebel Trooper in case you happen to go through all of your event suite, or you just never see anything in your event suite. eAckbar's scary, Hired Gun can do lots of damage people just don't expect. I really like this deck a lot.
Yeah, the largest compliment I can pay this deck is that, I've been trying a lot of weird, funky road decks for the past couple weeks just to diversify, and I always come to the event and people ask me, what are you playing? And I always say something weird, and my friends tend to say hero, and we usually get a laugh out of that because I historically just haven't had a lot of fun playing hero. There's, again, cards and aspects of hero decks that I like, but I just don't think they have enough to fully flesh out what I want to do. But this deck actually, does get to really use rearm really well. It can pay for reversal. It's got, again, just that toolbox nature that I find really interesting. It can do some smaller It's a Trap plays. It won't have the eAckbar blowout levels, but you do get that help from yellow with a little more removal options and some other support cards. So the fact that this deck does a little bit of everything, this is actually a hero deck I would play.
Yeah, and the biggest thing I definitely can't stress enough is Black One, Launchbane, Millennium Falcon are not required. They're usable, but you don't have to run them. And if you choose to, you only really need one of each. So you don't have to invest a lot of money into this deck. If you pull out those three, you're really looking at a Holdout Blaster being the most expensive card in the deck. So not only is it very powerful, but it is budget friendly. And if you just can't seem to find a lot of product in your area, it's very buildable if you have to buy singles off the secondary market. Most of these cards don't cost hardly anything. And I think that's great because we found a hero deck that has a lot of answers. It's strong, it's viable, and it doesn't break the bank. And I think that's great because more options for more players means, I think, more fun, personally. Any last thoughts as we wrap up the show, gentlemen?
I wanted to ask Rick real quick, since he wasn't able to make it to our last show, just a small continuation of our last episode, but is there one card that you think is going to grow in value or potential going into Spirit of the Rebellion?
So I think not necessarily a single card, but I would like to see supports being more useful in the next set. Right now, all but the best of the support dice are just not seeing any play, and I'm not sure if it's just because of the lack of the tempo that you lose by playing them and having to roll them again separately from your characters. You're only putting out one dice at a time when you do it, then making that whole battlefield fight be a little bit more difficult on your end. But I would like to see a little bit more support, if you understand what I'm saying. See them not necessarily, making a whole deck out of supports or anything like that, but just seeing them a little bit more useful. Because there are some good ones out there that just aren't seeing any play at all, like Black One and black market, things like that.
I'd love to see ATST hit the field more reliably.
And if you make supports better, ATST then becomes better.
Right.
I would just love some TIE fighters. We all have them now.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
We got full squadrons of TIE fighters now.
I think I have 12. You want to trade? We here at the Knights of Ren are super proud to announce that we are a sponsor of the Steel Open 2017 happening April 7th through 9 in Herndon, Virginia. You can find out more information at steelopen.com, where you can find out the events for not only Destiny, but X-Wing, Armada, and so much more. And you can also register yourself for this 3-day super amazing private event. Definitely check this out if you're interested in Destiny or any kind of Star Wars tabletop events. This is the premier place to check out games and get ready for Worlds, because this is happening 1 month before Worlds. You don't want to miss out. SteelOpen.com. All right, great. Well, that is this week's show. We have a lot of people we want to thank. First and foremost, we want to thank our Patreons for supporting the show, and everyone who listens and, likes and shares our stuff. Thank you very much. This is also a brand new show on the Beasts of War website, so welcome to anyone who joined us from them. We are so glad to have you. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the family. We are more than happy to talk about any questions you have, deck lists and whatnot. And this is our first show that we've officially been sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. So big thank you to them for sponsoring the show. There are a lot of great people who work there. It's a great storefront, and I highly recommend them. That's where I go. I live in Florida, so great company. And guys, just a reminder, Worlds is coming up really soon, and the registration is going to kick off in, I believe, 2 weeks. So anyone who's going to be coming to Worlds, we're going to be there. We're going to hang out, but don't miss out on your registration. That thing opens and closes really quickly. So definitely follow the FFG website for more information on signups and all that good stuff. And with that being said, this is another week in the can. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week, and may the Force be with you.